JP, thanks for joining us. How did it feel filling out that ballot for the first time?
I was excited, Dan. I really was. And I know that there are some voters that now look at this as this big ethical exercise, and they don't like it because of how difficult it is. But frankly, I feel honored. I think that the baseball writers, while certainly we've made mistakes in the past, maybe with some of our votes, whether it was the annual awards or the Hall of Fame, we do a pretty good job, and we do love the game. So I think that as long as you come at it from that angle, as opposed to how do we represent these generations of great players in the Hall of Fame the best that we can with all the information that we can, I was very comfortable doing it. I was very excited to do it. None of the negativity that maybe you hear about elsewhere.
How old are you?
I am 33.
Okay, so you've grown up in the steroid generation. That was your sweet spot here for baseball, right?
Absolutely, yes.
How are you viewing the steroid users or those who are rumored to have used?
Yeah, I think, Dan, the way that I delineate things is I've got a big line there on 2005, because 2005 was the first year that we saw baseball suspend players for steroid use. So that, I believe, is at the time when everybody said, okay, whatever happened before, happened before. We didn't really enforce the rules. Whatever happened then is sort of in the history books, and now going forward, we're going to police this stuff. So if you were suspended after 2005 and you come on the ballot, much as we've already seen with Rafael Palmeiro, I would not take a very charitable view towards offenders from that point forward. But before that, I'm talking about Bonds and Clemens, both of whom I voted for. I have a hard time singling them out when who knows what the actual percentage was, Dan, but it was pretty high. And whatever they did the same thing a lot of other people did. And I think it's our job, Dan, as the voters, to represent, as I pointed out, the best players of each generation within the context of the circumstances while they were playing. We can no more easily take out the steroids from the steroid era than go back and re-engineer all of the first half of the 20th century, acknowledging that no players of color were in the sport. Because that was the circumstances of that generation. We've got different circumstances in the steroid era, and we have to judge it of the circumstances of that time.
Do you consider Bonds and Clemens cheaters?
I do, Dan. But I look at them as saying there was a lot of cheating going on. It was an imperfect, flawed time. And there are different ways to cheat, whether it was a spitball or amphetamines, different things that have occurred during the course of the game. You would actually say that people putting pine tar on their gloves is cheating in a certain sense. And that still happens now. Or the bullfrog sunscreen we see that helps people get a better grip. That is technically cheating too. But I accept a certain amount of imperfection. I think that this notion of the Hall of Fame being a clean place, totally clean, is flawed. Our game, our national pastime, has flaws. Today, it's had flaws for the entirety of its existence. And I think to pretend that they didn't exist or turn the Hall of Fame into some hallowed place where only the morally pure can go, I just think is not a fair representation of what baseball is. It's not perfect, but we love it. And I think that as you walk through Cooperstown, Dan, I think it's important that we were able to tell the story of our sport, to say, listen, there was this period of time here where racism and prejudice was there, but we got over that, and there was this time in the game where steroids were there, and I think you can imagine being a father walking through with your kids explaining the history of the game. We cannot deny things that happened, and I think to bar the great players of a particular generation, I think would be doing that.
But to use your analogy or guidelines, then you probably think that Lance Armstrong should be able to keep the yellow jerseys, all of his Tour de France titles. Everybody else was using. I mean, they've proven that. So should Lance, therefore, he was the best of the cheaters, just like Bonds and Clemens, so they shouldn't be punished.
Well, I think that's a great question, and I think it's worth thinking about the same thing Ben Johnson in the Olympics, anybody that doped in the Olympics. I guess what I would say is every sport has its own unique standard, and I think, again, you go back, are we going to rip away every MVP or Cy Young that Roger Clemens or Barry Bonds won? I don't think we can do that. So to answer your question, I don't think that we can rip away Lance Armstrong's jersey unless he failed a test in that competition. I think that the Olympic analogy would be if you failed a test like Ben Johnson did right there, then I think you can take away that medal or that jersey. But I think to do it retroactively years later, and we even saw a situation a number of years ago when Ryan Braun, it was just 3 years ago, basically 4 years ago, Ryan Braun fails that test. Of course, he's ultimately exonerated, and then the biogenesis scandal implicates him. Well, what do we do about Matt Kemp finishing second to Braun in that very year for the MVP? So there are all these different issues that creep up over time. I think that the individual, if it's within the context of that competition, yes, take the medal, take the award away. But once that competition's over, once that period of time immediately afterward is done, I think you have to move on. That's in the history books, and I think you can change things going forward if it's a Hall of Fame if you want, but probably not the proximate competition of that particular year.
J.P. Morosi from Fox Sports, their baseball insider, first year voting for the Baseball Hall of Fame, joining us Dan Patrick Show. What happens when A-Rod hits the ballot?
It's a great question, Dan, because I think that, as I pointed out, my standard, again, this is the way I view it right now, and I may change my mind as time goes on, but right now, the fact that he was suspended during the era in which baseball is now cognizant of steroids and policing it aggressively, I would withhold my vote, because then now he is part of a smaller group of people who have actually been disciplined specifically for PED use at a time when we are now, as a sport, policing it. So I would say at this point, I would not vote for him. I think that probably a number of my peers will have the same opinion. But then again, Dan, we're seeing some of the projections now for Bonds and Clemens this year, and Ryan Thibodeau's done a great job of compiling them online in a great spreadsheet where you can actually see the totals year by year, where you're seeing Bonds and Clemens now potentially get up to around 50%. Mm-hmm. And they're about halfway through their time horizon on the ballot. So you start to wonder a little bit, if they get up there to 75% and actually get in a few years' time, then maybe it is harder to keep A-Rod out. Because there's no question, based on talent, Dan, even with the PEDs, much like Bonds, you can make this argument, he is one of the 5 or 10 greatest players we've ever seen in the sport. So, I'm going to have to revisit it when he comes on the ballot. My instinct now is, as I said, I draw that line of demarcation in 2005. But again, he is one of the greats of the game. And the one thing that's working in A-Rod's favor, Dan, is that he has now been able to return and write sort of his own ending to his story by virtue of the fact that his career did not end and then the steroid implications started. He's just played right through it, and he's still making new moments and new memories now for us to consider. So he is, if there's any way for him to get in, Dan, he's doing things the right way now by still playing and actually forcing us to have a conversation about him ongoing right now.
Congrats on getting the honor to vote for the Hall of Fame, and thanks for joining us. We appreciate it, JP.
Thanks, Dan. My pleasure. Been a big fan for a long time, so it's a great honor to be on the show today. Thank you.
Thank you. JP Morosi from Fox Sports Baseball Insider.